recording this as well. I'll put this up on my YouTube channel later, so don't worry if you need to check back in on something later. So my name's Ethan Tapper, the Chittenden County Forester. And if we haven't met before, just briefly explain who I am. Here's my first having to admit somebody. I'll briefly explain who I am and what county foresters do. So in Vermont, county foresters are part of what's called the private lands program. So basically, Vermont's about 75% forested. 80% of those forests are owned by private landowners, people, individuals, families. And so a massive amount of the forests that we all love and appreciate and that clean our air and our water and sequester and store carbon and provide wildlife for wildlife habitat for all of us, make Vermont such a beautiful place to live in, right? We live in the Green Mountain State, and the green on those mountains are trees and forests. So it's really, really important that we help people figure out how to manage their land well. And so there's a bunch of different parts to that. One part of that is that we administer the current use program. The use value appraisal program is its technical name, which is a tax abatement program for landowners who have more than 25 acres and they agree to manage their land responsibly by a forest management plan that's developed by a licensed forester and approved by the county forester and monitored by the county forester. And that's a really cool program because it helps people, gives them a substantial tax benefit. So it helps people be able to afford to own forested land and keep it as forest. And then also helps them manage it better. So they're managing it by a higher standard by this forest management plan that's developed by a professional. So that's really, really cool. So that's the biggest part of my job. And a lot of county foresters, that's the vast majority of what they do. The second part of our job is we are just a resource for owners of forests of any size. So if you own forested land, you can just call us and we'll just come out for free and talk to you about what's going on in your woods and opportunities for management, answer your questions about forests and forestry. The third part is that we help towns manage their municipal forests. So in Vermont, since 1915, we've had a history of municipal forests, town forests. They have a bunch of different names, but they're basically forested lands that are owned by a municipality and managed for all different kinds of stuff. And these places are really cool. In Chittenden County, there's about a dozen of them covering over 4,000 acres. And if you live in Chittenden County, you can get to any of them in like 40 minutes. So that's pretty cool. And then the fourth part is the really exciting part, which is we get to be creative about how to improve the health of forests and the quality of forest management in our county. So in Chittenden County, it might be really different than it is in one of the counties, Orleans County, up in the Northeast Kingdom. But that's sort of where we get to see what are the threats to healthy forests and responsible forest management, and how can we address them in a way that's creative and that's responsive to our communities. So with that, I'll talk a little bit about the radical forest management. This is a presentation that I've been doing for a while. If you go on my YouTube channel, you see there's a bunch of different recordings of it. Every time I do it, it's a little bit different. And I just like add information and put up slides and to sort of, steer that conversation in different directions. It's something I'm really excited about and really, I think is a powerful framework for rethinking our relationship to forests and our relationship to forests in the context of a world that we want to be kinder and more just and more functional ecologically. So with that, I would just say, if you have any questions, we'll have time for questions at the end. So just plug them into the chat box. Happy to clarify or talk about anything at all. And I will start the presentation. All right, the radical forest manager. That's me, Ethan Tapper, the Chittenden County Forester. That's my email. And if you guys want to be kept apprised of future events like this, you can send me an email at ethan.tapper@vermont.gov. It's really easy to find. You can just look up Chittenden County Forester and ask to be on my mailing list, and I'll put you on there. Or you can also just, bug me with all your questions about forests and trees and all that stuff, and I'm really happy to help out if I can. So what's radical? So this concept of the radical forest management really came out of two different definitions of this word. So the first traditional definition from the Latin word radix, meaning root, relating to or affecting the fundamental nature of something. So it's something really far-reaching, thorough, profound, different from the usual or traditional, favoring extreme changes, fundamental changes in existing views, habits, conditions, or institutions. So this idea that you're upending something at the root, fundamentally. And so the way I think about sort of forest management is, while there's forest management that's being practiced really well, also we have the opportunity to sort of upend the way we think about forests and the way that we think about managing them, and to manage them in a way that's fundamentally different from the forest management that you may have heard about from other parts of the country, other parts of the world, et cetera. The second definition is one that has much more sort of connotations to it, connotations of political or social change, political, economic, social reforms. This idea that you're incorporating into a decision-making process or into an attitude, not just upending something at the root, but specifically looking at justice. And I believe that, especially, and this is such a profound moment for justice, right? I believe that there is an opportunity to manage for our forests for a more just world, in addition to just making our forests healthier. So the principles of the radical forest manager, this idea that you have to zoom out. So it's really easy to sort of just focus on what's right in front of you, but zoom out, place yourself in a broader ecological, historical, and social context. Recognize that nothing exists in the vacuum, that all of these systems that we find ourselves in are porous, and that everything you do is connected to many other things, and especially that's true for the forests, which are sort of these creatures of connection. Be educated, open, informed, and humble. Embrace nuance. Be willing to take a belief that you've held for a long time and maybe haven't thought about extensively, and turn it over and really think about it and really consider it. Because as you learn more, your understanding of these different really complicated concepts, especially as you zoom out, start to change. And finally, I think you have to be brave. You have to be willing to make tough, uncomfortable decisions to do the right thing. And so I love forests, and my love of forests drives me to do things which, on the small scale, cutting trees, killing invasive plants, killing deer, like all these other things on the small scale, you're like, whoa, that's really intense and maybe scary or sort of counterintuitive. But I know that it's the right thing for the forest that I'm working in. And so it requires sort of courage. And what's really radical sometimes is to do things that are really challenging, to do the right thing, to do things that really challenge your sense of what's right and wrong when you know that it's right. So the first part of this picture is, let's reframe how we think about forests. So what are forests? If you look up on the internet these definitions of what a forest is, you will find definitions that are largely dominated by trees, right? So that's the thing that we would all think of with forests, right? There's lots of trees. You go into a forest, there's trees everywhere. Okay, I know I'm in a forest. A large area covered chiefly with trees and undergrowth, a large area full of trees, usually wild, right? So is a forest anywhere where there's a bunch of trees? I would argue no. I really like this definition of a natural community as a better definition for what forests are. So rather than just a bunch of trees anywhere, an interacting assemblage of organisms, their physical environment, and the natural processes that affect them, which is from Wetland, Woodland, Wildland, which is a really amazing book by Liz Thompson, Eric Sorensen, with a new edition where Bob Zano also is an author. What that does is really capture this idea that forests are systems. So forests are interconnected, and they involve trees and plants and fungi and microorganisms, and the processes that govern and change these systems, which the processes themselves are completely integral to their function. So trees are a part of that. And sometimes we get lost in the trees because they're these really big, amazing, impressive parts of these systems. But by no means are the trees the only important part. And by no means can we only focus on the trees if we want to really do these ecosystems justice. One thing that I've become really obsessed with is looking at old growth forests. So Vermont's land use history is really weird. I'll talk about that in a second. But as a result of that land use history, we have like virtually no old growth forests left. And so what's really weird about that is that the templates we have for judging what forests are supposed to look like are flawed, because the forests that we have are largely very young, and actually don't have the features that are endemic to forests as forests to grow and develop over a long period of time. So looking at forests prior to European settlement and looking at forests which haven't been prominently impacted by humans is a really good way to think about how forests actually want to grow and develop, or how they sort of manage themselves. So old growth forests are forests which have developed without extensive disturbance for a long time. That doesn't mean that all the trees in them are really old. So old growth forests as systems have not been extensively disturbed. So all the trees haven't died all at once, but they regularly experience small scale mortality. So a tree dies, a couple of trees die, and it actually creates this constant sort of patchwork of growth and regeneration, which creates this really diverse environment. And it's not because all the trees are really old, it's because the system is old. And within that system, all sorts of different interesting things happen, which include regular mortality. It depends on the forest type, but in many cases, we think about 150 years old without extensive disturbance. That's how long it takes a forest to become what we might call an old growth forest. For some of the characteristics to develop, like dead wood is a really important part of these old growth forests. For those dead wood characteristics to develop, a forest might have to avoid large scale disturbances for like 275 to 300 years. So a really, really long time it takes for them to develop. And you can imagine that prior to European settlement, the forests which had been developing in Vermont and the rest of New England have been developing for hundreds and thousands of years. Prior to European settlements, so we're talking 1600s and before, about 55 to 60% of New England's forests were old growth by this definition, older than 150 years old. Today, it's less than 0.5%. So what are they like? They don't look like you might imagine. So again, we all have this idyllic vision of what old growth forests look like. It's these evenly spaced trees, and they're all really big and old and tall and impressive. In reality, there are big old trees, but they're sort of scattered around in pockets of big old trees. But there's also many different sizes and ages of trees. There's many different species of trees, diverse composition. So composition is just the different species of trees present in a forest. Usually there's more trees that are what we call shade tolerant, because there are these regular small scale disturbances creating little openings in the canopy, not creating enough light to get some of our really light loving species like white birch and aspen, but more like American beech. This is a big old yellow birch in this picture here, sugar maple, hemlock, species like that, especially American beech and hemlock, which are two of our most shade tolerant species, or by far our most common species in Vermont prior to European settlement. Structural complexity and structural diversity, what that means is many different sizes and ages of trees. So if you think about it, you have a bunch of trees all growing up following a big windstorm or something like that, a large scale disturbance. They all grew up, they're all the same age. And then over time, what you'll see is that individual large trees die, pockets of trees die through ice storms and windstorms and insect and disease outbreaks. Every time that the canopy is broken in a forest and light gets through to the forest floor, there is regeneration. And just naturally, all these species just fill that gap. The trees beside expand their crowns, and from the understory, you'll see new trees. And so you get all these different sizes and ages of trees in these old forests, because as time goes on, there's more and more of these small scale disturbances all the time, creating more and more of these different little regeneration events, more and more little generations of trees. Also a feature of old growth forest, canopy gaps. So it's not this flat, intact canopy. If you flew over it, you would see that there's holes all over the place in these in the forest. So these gaps in the canopy that can be, usually pretty small, from like the crown of a single tree to several trees to 1/4 of an acre, something like that. There's dead wood everywhere. So trees fall over, they rot on the ground. There's dead wood of trees of all different shapes and sizes and species, which all have different qualities. Deep, well-developed soils, because all of that wood is just decomposing into the soil. And actually, as trees fall over, they're mixing those soils. And so you get this really deep, rich soil. And forests, which are in generally what I would call continuously developing. So again, not avoiding mortality, not avoiding disturbance, but as a system, they're continually developing and becoming more complex. And as a system, while they're characterized by being dynamic, which is a really, really important feature of forests that we don't often think about, the system as a whole is stable over time. So by being diverse, it avoids large-scale destabilizing disturbances. So one thing that I talk about, and I used to talk about diversity a lot, now I talk about complexity a lot. And there, in many ways, these two things are the same. So diversity is just a quantity, right? There's many different species of trees. There's many different sizes and ages of trees. There's lots of different types of stuff. Oh, I'm just gonna admit somebody. So what that means is that, you just have like the sheer quantity. Complexity is a quality. So complexity is the quality of many different types of diversity layered over each other and these complex interactions between them. So it's defined by the interactions and the many different layers over time. And as forests develop over time, they become sort of more and more and more complex. Now, the interesting thing about diversity and complexity is that these are concepts that are really hard for humans to understand because we want everything to be simple and understandable, and it doesn't even look neat to boot. But diversity and complexity are linked to increased forest health, resilience, better wildlife habitat, more carbon sequestration and storage, and forests which are more adaptive to changes and just are generally more rich with life. And so an example of this, there's this amazing guy, E.O. Wilson, that many of you may have heard of, who's a bug guy. He's an invertebrate guy. And he thinks that we should start calling invertebrates wildlife. And one of the reasons is just because the diversity of invertebrates, while they escape our attention, are this incredibly important part of what makes our systems, our ecological systems, I should say, work. So they perform all these really critical nutrient cycling things. They're the base of our food webs and feed all the animals that we do know about and that we do really care about. And in general, they just sort of they're the little things that make the world work, as he would say. They make everything work, and they're incredible. And one of the things that's incredible about them is just their diversity. So here's a graph of the number of species in Vermont by different type of species. These are what we call wildlife, but excluding invertebrates. So you're like, okay, there's a lot of birds, there's some fish, reptiles, amphibians, bunch of mammals. This is with invertebrates. So Vermont has about 21,000 species of invertebrates compared to 58 species of mammals. And so this massive amount of diversity, from pollination to nutrient cycling, all these other things, are incredibly important. And just one example of the massive amount of diversity that's endemic in an ecosystem, and in a forested ecosystem, that may escape your attention if you're just thinking about trees. He also thinks, E.O. Wilson, who's a really good guy, you guys should look up some videos of him. He also thinks we should start calling invertebrates wildlife, because by not calling them wildlife, we sort of give them a short shrift. So again, just to reiterate, these next two slides I have in pretty much every presentation that I do. This is an example of sort of what we think, I'm going to admit someone else, what we think healthy forests look like, right? We have this idyllic view of forests, and we think that they should look neat and tidy, and this is what we think neat and tidy looks like for whatever reason. So evenly spaced trees, big and tall, old, you can see right through the understory. Isn't that beautiful? But as we learn more about forests, we understand again that forests are dynamic, and that forests are many of the things that we think about as being what makes forests messy are actually the things that make them so full of life. Dead wood on the ground, gaps in the canopy, trees that have died and blown over. All of these things are things that are intuitively unattractive to us, unpleasant to us, but are actually to forests these incredibly important parts of it, of how they work. One thing that's really interesting is that we have all this new research about that used to be this sort of like woo-wooey, trees are connected to each other and sharing resources through underground, what we call the mycorrhizal network, these connections with fungal threads that connect their root systems together, and they're passing resources, whatever. passing messages. Science just has supported that. It's not a theory, it's a fact. Trees are connected. And forests are connected, and the depth of those connections increases as forests develop and age. And this is all borne out by solid research, which is supported again and again and again. And so one of the interesting things, when some people hear that and they hear that trees are altruistic and all these other things, they say, oh, geez, we need to be really scared to do anything in the forest because, suddenly they're like us, right? So we can't do anything with them. And I found the understanding that to be vindicating, because what I understood is that forests are systems and that they're defined by disturbance and that they're dynamic. And so suddenly, you don't have to be afraid of, cutting an individual tree to do something really good. That in the language of forest is something that can be really positive, and the system as a whole understands death and is not afraid of it. It celebrates it. I often say messy is good because many of the things that we think look messy end up being some of the best things in the forest. So in context, sort of place ourselves in context as we think about the way our forests work. Vermont's about 75% forested. Again, 80% of those lands are privately owned by individuals and families, which is pretty incredible. I think of it as sort of this great experiment, right? Like we're entrusting these massively important ecosystems, which are not only intrinsically important in their own right, but also providing all of us with these public benefits that we take for granted all the time. And we're saying, okay, all you private landowners, here you go. It's your responsibility, and we hope you make the right choice. But within that, we are losing forested land. So it's decreasing by, depending on who you ask, about 2,000 acres a year. Our rate of development, the area that we're developing, is increasing twice as fast as our population, which just means that we're not developing efficiently. We're using too much land in our development. Our average parcel size is decreasing, and the number of landowners is increasing. So what that means is that our landscape is increasingly fragmented into smaller and smaller chunks. Forests function as blocks, so they're healthier the bigger they are in general, and so that's really problematic. And again, I mentioned this sort of in my introduction, but these forests are privately owned, but the benefits that they're producing are public, and we're enjoying them all the time. So literally, the air that you breathe, the water that you drink, the wildlife that you enjoy knowing exists, and maybe you hunt them, or maybe you go out wildlife watching, or you're a wildlife photographer, or that you just think, like many of us do, that they have the right to exist, right? The fact that you get to drive to work and go for hikes and bike around in this beautiful forested landscape, most of those forests are privately owned. They're owned by people, and they exist sort of at the grace of those people and their restrictions that we have that protect forests. And so that's incredibly powerful. And I think that as people like myself who own a piece of forested land, we need to recognize that it's not just about doing whatever we want to do, right? It's also about that we have some responsibility toward this public trust to protect our neighbors and our communities and our world. So take all that within a context of what I would call global change. So instead of talking about climate change, now I talk about global change, because climate change is just one of many different factors that threaten the health of our ecosystems globally. I consider it to be basically climate change plus other human-caused stressors. So this includes altered natural disturbance regimes, which are in many cases a result of climate change. So different things, like windstorms and rain events like we have occurring in different ways, different severities, different frequencies. The invasive exotic plants, animals, pests, and pathogens that we've introduced that regularly threaten our biodiversity, the loss of forests, the conversion of forests, the fragmentation of forests into smaller and smaller pieces, pollution, all of these other things are also incredible threats that, and many of them have feedbacks into climate change, but it's not just climate change, it's really all of these things contributing to this bigger idea of global change, which is happening right now, has been happening for a long time. And one of the interesting things is that, again, I talked about using old growth forest sort of as a template. So to tell me what or to tell us in this sort of the forest management, the forest research community, what forests do when they manage themselves and when humans don't mess with them. While those are a useful reference, it's also really interesting because the forests that we're managing for in the future are going to be different than those forests were 300 years ago, just because of how altered our landscape is right now. And so we need to manage forests which are not just like old growth forests, but which are also adaptive and resilient. And I'll talk about what that means in a second. Mitigating climate change in itself is radical. And I think that that's really important because it protects our ecosystems, and our ecosystems, as I'll discuss a little bit later, protect a lot of things, other things that are really, really important, not just to our ecological health, but also to the health of our communities and justice and equity in our communities. So let's take a drink of water here. Many of us in the forest management community have abandoned this idea of stability. So stability is your ability to make a forest that stays the same, right? And I actually mentioned stability when I talked about old growth forests as, sort of a term. It's a term that we all understand, right? It means something stays as it is. But we really don't want forests to stay as they are. We don't want to, force them to become these like static, unchanging entities. We want them to change all the time and to continue to be dynamic, but to be able to be healthy throughout that change. So we don't talk about stability, we talk about resilience. Resilient forests are forests that are capable of maintaining their health and natural processes throughout great stress and change. So these are forests that are able to be healthy in the midst of a changing climate, in the midst of all these other elements of global change, invasive exotic diseases, and losing other species from their ecosystem, stuff like that, and the changing natural disturbance dynamics. There's a lot of great resources on how we manage our forests to be more resilient, especially in the context of a changing climate. And for the most part, it is also to manage our forests to have many of those same attributes that those old growth forests have. So to have many different species and sizes and ages of trees, diversity and complexity. I'll give the forest sort of more tools in its toolkit to be able to respond to the different forms that global change takes. If it targets a specific species or a specific age of trees or whatever, if a forest is sort of doing many different things and is, presenting has sort of many different options, it will be able to weather that storm better and to be able to sort of adapt to the new normal of what our climate's like and whatever that future forest is going to look like. There's also a lot of hype around managing forests for carbon. And this is a big thing, managing forests for carbon offsets. Is that going to be something that people can do, that is a supplement or replacement to cutting trees? One of the things about forest carbon that's really interesting is that, so forests naturally sequester and store carbon. That's what photosynthesis is basically a forest, a tree, a leaf, a plant, using sunlight to fix aerial carbon. So through the process of photosynthesis, they're able to take carbon from the air and turn it into wood and leaves and plant material. As I'll talk about in the next slide, trees sequester carbon, but actually forests, the system, are really what sequester carbon. We can manage for forest carbon in general by, guess what? Increasing diversity, increasing resilience, like we just talked about, keeping forests as forests, so preventing them from being, converted into a house or a parking lot, where they will never sequester and store carbon again, right? Retaining some big trees on our landscape, avoiding these large scale disturbances, because these big large scale disturbances in general cause most of the carbon that's fixed within a forest to be released as it's digested very quickly. And I'll touch on that in the next slide. And also managing our forests to be resilient by managing them for resilience. Remember, if we manage them to be sort of diverse in all these different ways and complex, we also buffer them from these large scale disturbances by, allowing small scale disturbance to occur. But because the forest is so complex, it's not doing all of any one thing. And so in general, these big, large scale disturbances that wipe out everything become less common. Leaving lots of dead wood in the forest is really important, and just in general, protecting long-term forest health, especially in the context of invasive exotic pests and pathogens. There are trade-offs between managing for carbon and for managing for ecologically healthy landscapes. So I'll talk about in a later slide about how our landscapes, in addition to our forests not being that much like old growth forests were, our landscapes also are not like landscapes were prior to European settlement in general. One of the things we don't have enough of is young forests. So large areas where we basically, there is a large scale disturbance, which happens sometimes and we want some of it. Managing for like big open areas is not a great way to manage for carbon, but there are many wildlife species that depend on those things. And we know that they're underrepresented across our landscape. So that's sort of what I'm talking about in managing for an ecologically healthy landscape. We have to sort of make some trade-offs. And at the same time, another example of this is as we're managing our forests to be more resilient, we're going to be cutting trees, which in the short term, those trees are no longer sequestering carbon. We might let some light on the forest floor that'll cause a little bit of digestion of the carbon in the soil. But in the long term, we're going to be protecting it from a large scale release of carbon, which would happen by these big, large scale disturbances, which we're protecting them from by making them more diverse. And there's trade-offs between carbon management and producing local renewable resources. So another thing I feel really passionate about is this idea of the importance to our human communities of using local renewable resources. The way that we manage for the most carbon is by cutting no trees, but that's not necessarily the way that we manage for the most justice or that we manage in the context of our altered landscape. This is a really cool graphic that was produced by Tony D'Amato and Paul Catanzaro in this awesome publication that you see cited down there on the lower right, Forest Carbon, an Essential Natural Resource for Climate Change, produced by UMass. Tony D'Amato's pretty much the author of like all the really cool papers about all this stuff. And he's right here at UVM. He's an amazing resource. And so what this graphic shows is a few different things. So it shows here in the brown, it shows the changes in carbon storage over time in a forest. So from year 0, let's say that this is what we call a stand replacing disturbance, a large scale natural disturbance. So let's say you got 20 acres, every tree is blown over from a massive hurricane. So as that forest develops, you start here from a place of essentially no stored or embodied carbon in that system as a result of the fact that when there's all this light and all this heat, all the carbon that was stored, and most carbon is stored in soils. In Vermont, it's about 65% of the carbon is not in the living trees, but in the soils. The carbon that's in the soils is very quickly digested. So you're starting from a very low point. As the forest develops, it gradually accrues carbon in that system in the living trees and also mostly in the soils. And it just continues to accrue that. And here we are at year 500, and it's been just sort of gradually accruing carbon over time. Here in this green circle, what we're seeing is changes in carbon sequestration over time. So storage is just the total amount of carbon that we've stored in that forest. Sequestration is the rate at which trees are sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. So these two things are different. Forests, not trees, but forests are sequestering carbon most quickly when they hit about 20, 30 years after a large scale disturbance. And they're like, as these young trees are growing really, really rapidly, they have all this light, no shade. They're just sucking up a ton of carbon as they're growing really fast. And we see that sequestration after this initial part actually sort of declines or stays stable here for the next few hundred years. This was, for a long time, thought to be sort of a dog whistle to the timber industry. So they were like, well, we want to sequester carbon, so we got to put in, all these big clear cuts because we want to create these young forests. What they were neglecting to say is that while they were creating forests that were sequestering carbon very quickly, by creating those young forests and creating those big patch cuts, while there are some benefits to them, they were ignoring the fact that carbon storage, the total amount of carbon in that system, they were sort of starting from 0 every time, and they were releasing massive amounts of carbon as they did those clear cuts. What you'll also see here on this inner ring is just the tolerance of different tree species to shade. So as a forest develops over time. So here at year 0, we have our shade intolerant species like aspens and birches. They need to grow like completely in the open, and they grow really fast. And as a forest develops over time, and the canopy fills in, we go into more of mid-tolerant species like our red oak and yellow birch, stuff like that. And as a forest gets older and develops and becomes more like in that old growth condition, large scale disturbances are less frequent. And so what we see is more species which are tolerant of shade, like American beech and eastern hemlock, sugar maple, becoming more dominant in the forest. So this is a really important graph because it shows the way that forests develop over time. And it also shows the difference between carbon sequestration and storage. We want a lot of carbon sequestration, but we also want a lot of carbon stored in our systems if we're going to, sort of mitigate the effects of climate change. The other thing that I spend a lot of time with as a threat to our forest is invasives. So invasives are basically invasive exotic species, biological invasions, we'd also call them globally. They're a major threat to global biodiversity. And again, this includes not just plants, which is mostly what I deal with, but also pest pathogens. They account for about half of all extinctions, of which the cause is known. Many of those are invasive animals. And according to the National Wildlife Federation, 42% of endangered species are primarily threatened by invasives. So basically, as it was explained to me one time, which I thought was really apt, as species evolve in a given context, in an environment, they evolve not just sort of on their own to the best possible, way that they can. They evolve in reaction to their landscape. And so they're in this like perpetual arms race with other species that they're competing with and species that are their predators and all these other things. And so when a novel species is introduced into that landscape, or one of those species is plucked out from that landscape that's been co-evolving together for a long time and put somewhere else, it's basically released of all of its evolutionary constraints. And so an example of this is in Guam. This is the brown tree snake. Guam just didn't have any snakes. They didn't have anything that was going to, just go and eat birds and, steal eggs out of the nests of birds and basically caused all of the bird species in Guam to go extinct. 10 are completely extinct. The other 2 that are endemic to Guam are considered functionally extinct as a result of the introduction of this one species. Invasive exotic plants are one thing that I deal with a lot. So they decrease our ecosystem diversity, resiliency, health, carbon sequestration and storage, wildlife habitat, you name it. These species basically decrease a forest's ability to do that. And it's exactly the same as with the brown tree snake, except in maybe less of a easily noticeable way, where they're just sort of coming into our forest, outcompeting our native species, and threatening the fundamental function of our forests. And our native species just can't compete with them. And they have all these tools that were adapted to a different landscape that our native species were not adapted to. It's expected that the prevalence of these plants will increase as our climate continues to change. And one of the weird things, this is an example when we talk about as part of being a radical forest manager, or being, radical in general as someone who's interested in a healthy, functional ecosystem forest, you got to make tough decisions. And so one of the things that I've come to as a person who is not like an herbicide guy or someone who is intuitively comfortable with the concept of herbicide is that in many cases, most cases with these species, using herbicide is the only way to control them. And it's sort of an inconvenient truth because no one wants to do that. And we're all, hear horror stories about the way that herbicide is used in agriculture and our food systems. And of course, we don't want that. But applied in a really minimal targeted way to individual plants, it makes a massive positive difference in the way that our forests grow and their health. And it's actually this incredibly, using it as a restoration tool is sort of this like incredibly powerful, radical thing that now basically every conservation organization uses. We all use this because it works and because we recognize that the threat posed by these invasive exotic plants is so profound that it's worth making really tough decisions in order to take care of it. This is the one that really keeps me up at night. So you can't do anything. You can't have any of these benefits of healthy forests if you don't have a forest. So this is an example of, the picture you're seeing here is an example of a fragmented forest, right? So here's this property. This is a ridge line. This is in Vermont. And instead of just, here's the main road right here. Jeff, this is in Richmond. Here's the main road right here. And instead of putting, their houses here or here, down by this road where the habitat is already fragmented and here's this big intact forested block, they punched this road in all the way, this really crazy road, all the way up through the property, clear cut the top of this ridge line and put their house right here. So what they did is basically split this bigger forested block up into smaller and smaller pieces. So what's a fundamental threat to our forests is losing forests. The most important thing, more important than any of these other things pretty much, is keeping forests as forests, because if we can't keep them as forests, we can't do anything. Development, conversion, partialization, splitting them up into smaller and smaller parcels, and fragmenting them into smaller and smaller chunks with roads, house sites, clearings like this, is a fundamental threat to our forests. And it's essentially permanent. And so it's really hard to take them back. When I first was, marking trees to be cut for the first time as a forester, someone handed me a paint gun and they were like, well, just be careful because it's pretty hard to stand them back up again. And it's way easier to stand trees up again than it is for them to grow through pavement. We need to advocate for the way that we basically prevent this is by advocating for denser development, which is weird, right? But we need to cluster our development. It doesn't mean that we can't build any more houses or businesses. It just means that we need to cluster our development in places that are already fragmented and avoid further fragmentation of our intact forested blocks. And so this is one of these things where the policy that you have in your village about where people are allowed to build, and maybe some of these uncomfortable decisions like advocating for bigger, taller buildings, a building code that allows taller buildings in your village, might have a direct line to making our forests, keeping our forests intact and keeping our forests as forests, because it could lower the development pressure on those forested blocks. And we need to sort of couple that increased clustering of our development with increased protections for forested blocks. So you can't do this. You shouldn't be able to do that. Because while that is that person's private land, they are significantly impacting a public resource, like the ability of our forests to be functional in the long term. You can get on, if you live in one of these in a community, there's usually a planning commission or board, development review board, conservation commissions. They're always looking for members, and you can volunteer on that and have a significant impact on the way that your community is developed. And we need to conserve as much forested land permanently with conservation easements as possible. So protecting these forested blocks as much as we can. Okay, so that's sort of placing our forests in context. So now let's talk about reframing the historical context in which we find ourselves. So starting in the 1800s, many of you have heard this story if you're from Vermont. Starting in the 1800s, Napoleon invaded Spain. There was this special kind of sheep that was never allowed to be, it sounds like I'm starting to tell like a storybook story. There was this very special kind of sheep that wasn't allowed to be exported from Spain. There was all this chaos as a result of the Napoleonic Wars. This guy, William Jarvis, who was a United States consul to Portugal, was able to export some of these sheep that we now know as merino sheep to his farm in Wethersfield, Vermont. By the, I think 1830s, there were 1 to 1.7 million of them. And so one of the things about sheep is they can graze pretty much everywhere. Their wool was like crazy valuable, and everybody lost their minds. And by the mid 1800s, about 80% of Vermont was cleared for both pasture and for other resource exploitation related to agriculture, fence posts, charcoal, stuff like that. And so what that means is that basically every forest you've ever been in Vermont, unless it's like really secluded or on the top of a mountain, completely inaccessible. It was a pasture at this time, which is weird to think about. And it's not that long ago, you know, it's a couple hundred years ago. It's a long time for us, but it's not that long in the context of forests, which develop over hundreds of thousands of years. That decline, the wool markets as related to some lifting of tariffs and other stuff, westward expansion, those wool prices declined by the late 1800s, and many farms switched to dairy. There were these sort of big pulses of reforestation as these forested lands were allowed to revert back to forested lands, which they did very abundantly. And there was certainly one sort of in that late 1800s, followed by a timber boom in the early 1900s when all those trees became mature and we cut them all again. Vermont was briefly the timber capital of the US in very early 1900s. And then again in especially the early mid 1900s when a lot of those small scale dairies went out of business. As a result of that, we also lost many wildlife species. So this is the last catamount that was shot in Barnard in 1881. Many of these species were driven to extinction by overharvesting. You know, people came here and they just thought that there was this unending abundance of everything and they could take whatever they wanted. They thought that they could start cutting trees on the East Coast, and by the time they got to wherever the westward end of this land was, that the ones on the East Coast would have grown back and they go cut them again. Of course, that isn't true. So overharvesting, and also, as you can see by the picture behind this guy, habitat loss. So they destroyed the forested habitat that was in excess of 95% of our forests everywhere and created all these pastures. So in the 1800s, we lost beaver, turkey, fisher, moose, caribou, elk. Caribou and elk were the native ungulates in Vermont mostly. Catamount, eastern catamount is now extinct. Timber wolves, bear, otter, Canada geese, marten, passenger pigeons now extinct, and others. And so one of the really important things as you think about forests as systems is that is incredibly sad, because these species deserve to exist. And then also those species have impacts on our ecosystem. So it's not just that, here are ecosystems over here and here are wildlife over here. The wildlife perform really important ecosystem functions that support our forest. And so losing our wildlife vastly alters the way these systems function. We did introduce some of these. Beaver's a really interesting story. By the 1760s, 250,000 beaver pelts had been shipped to Europe from the Connecticut River Valley of Vermont alone. So prior to that time, when the settlers got here, the beaver had already been decimated. Prior to that time, there was estimated to be as many as 300 beaver dams per square mile in Vermont in valley habitat. So that's about a beaver dam every 2 acres, a square mile, 640 acres, which is pretty amazing. This is an example here. You see in the early 1900s, they reintroduced beaver. We also reintroduced fisher, reintroduced white-tailed deer in the late 1800s. Turkey were reintroduced. So we did help it along, but we didn't reintroduce everybody, and we didn't reintroduce predators. And the predators, we're now seeing that with deer overabundance and stuff like that. There were some other interesting things that happened, like there was for many years a porcupine bounty because we trapped out all the fishers for their pelts. And so they were the native predator of the porcupines, and porcupines lost their natural controls. And you could turn in a pair of porcupine ears to the town clerk for years and get issued a bounty. And I think there was allegedly some counterfeiting of porcupine ears that went on. Another example of an unintended consequence of the loss of predators is the deer explosion in the 1960s to the 1980s in Vermont, when deer were way overpopulated, and that population went down and it's again rising. I should also say, prior to European settlement, we didn't really have white-tailed deer, except for in a couple little small populations. We didn't have fox. We didn't have coyotes. They weren't here till the 1940s. Fox were introduced from Europe. Earthworms, all the earthworms we have are European and Asian. We have starlings, house sparrows, some of our grassland bird species. None of those were here. So the legacy of the 1800s is that our forests are younger, they're less diverse, they lack some of these features that these pre-settlement forests would have had, like big trees, dead wood, soil carbon. Our landscapes as a whole lack a balance of forests of different types and sizes and ages because our landscape is young. They haven't had a chance to become diverse in the same way that our forests haven't had a chance to become diverse. The species that tree species we have are different, and the wildlife species and their interaction with our forests are different. Coupled with that, our history of forest management and logging has not been great. There's this idea of the regulated forest that we would and we should control every aspect of the forest and grow trees as efficiently as possible, cutting all big old trees, which we call decadent, and replacing them with young, fast-growing trees, which we call thrifty, ignoring, of course, the massive ecosystem benefits of big trees. A lot of high grading, just cutting what high grading and diameter limit cutting are, is you go in there and you cut the healthiest or the biggest trees. As you can imagine, that results in a less healthy forest because you cut all the healthy trees and you left all the unhealthy trees, and not protecting our forest. In general, intentionally or otherwise, our historic forest management and logging basically serve to simplify and degrade our forests rather than doing what we really want to do, which is to enrich them and to make them more complex and more diverse. So let's now talk about reframing forest management. So the big question, one of the big questions of the work that I do and the big questions of this presentation is, can management of our forests have a positive influence on them? And can managing our forests have a positive influence on the world? So bringing this to a global landscape, we need to recognize that globally, we have rapid global forest cover loss, mass loss of global biodiversity. The US is a big part of the reason for this. We're less than 5% of the global population, and we're about a third of the global resource consumption. Globally, resource consumption in general is increasing. And I'm going to talk about this more, but climate change, resource extraction, consumption, processing disproportionately affects poorer and more vulnerable communities. Our consumption disproportionately affects people who are less fortunate than we are. Hold on one second. So there's this idea of the land ethic, which is this idea originally posited, as far as I know, by Aldo Leopold in the 1940s, which is just trying to hammer out a positive functional role for humans in our ecosystems. What he said is that the land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community, and he means the human community, to also include soils, waters, plants, animals, or collectively the land. Changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. It implies respect for his fellow members and also respect for the community as such. So we're suddenly not just, we're here and the land is over here. We're all part of the same community, which is a belief which is not just, rosy and idyllic, but it's also founded in science. To think of ourselves as not completely biologically and geochemically dependent on our ecosystems is just ridiculous, because we completely are. There's also this idea that I really like of a sort of a bundle of rights versus a bundle of responsibilities. Traditionally, we think of owning property as holding this bundle of rights. These are all the things I can do. Robin Wall Kimmerer, in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, which is an amazing book, talks about having a bundle of responsibilities. So why wouldn't we have, in addition to those rights, why wouldn't we also have responsibilities to take care of our land? Why wouldn't we also, there be expectations of that we could, there would be things that we could and should do and that we owe to that land. But instead we sort of have this idea of the bundle of rights, which is just, these are all the things I can do to the land. Also recognizing that we live in a time which is called by some the Anthropocene, which is a geologic era in which humans and human behavior is the dominant influence on our climate and on our ecology. We have this massive constriction of biodiversity going on that's really scary. Global animal populations are 50% of what they are and where they were in 1970. That doesn't mean 50% of the number of species. It means there are 50% of the number of individual animals on the planet than there were 50 years ago. And we have extinction occurring at a rate that is much larger than the background rate, just the rate that extinctions naturally occur. In the background, this is a species which is extinct from Vermont, from the eastern seaboard. It's called the eastern elk, either a species or a subspecies of western elk. that was a forest dwelling elk that lived here prior to European settlement and was gone by the 1700s. So what we need to sort of add to this brew of all this like craziness as we think about what is the role of humans in our ecosystems and what is the role of forest management in making the world a better place, also think about environmental and climate justice and recognize that impoverished communities, communities of color, much more likely to live in polluted areas and have exposure to toxic substances, less likely to have access to clean air and water. The list goes on and on of all these really sobering facts about sort of what's called environmental racism, environmental injustice. And the fact is that that many of these impacts are impacts related to resource extraction and to resource processing. And these are resources that we consume all the time. And we just are fortunate enough that and privileged enough that we don't have to deal with these impacts in our day-to-day lives. So in response to that, I don't know if this is a good couple of terms or not, but I came up with the way that I think about the polarities within, the forest management community, the way that we think about our ecosystems is in the face of all this stuff, there are takers and there are leavers. Takers I think of as more of sort of the traditional component of the forest management industry and sort of just the traditional component of the way that we think about resources, which is that these things exist just for us to take, right? The only purpose of forests is to provide us with resources, economic gain, personal enjoyment. Anything we do in service of those things is okay, right? Can't do wrong. And then there are leavers who believe the exact opposite. Nothing we do can be okay. There is nothing that we can do that can ever be positive. In my mind, both of these ideas are sort of problematic in their own way. So the takers are disregarding the fact that there are many things we can do that we shouldn't do, that damage the ability of forests to provide future generations with these public benefits, right? And leavers disregard the possibility that there's anything we can do proactively for forests, even as they're struggling with these massive problems that humans created, that we created, and our understanding of them of forests is improving. So maybe we can do a better job, but it's very hard to talk to either of these people when in reality, the answer probably lies somewhere in between. And so sort of in this in between, or I would even say this is sort of off the spectrum in a whole different realm, is this idea of ecological forestry. So we're managing for resources. We're cutting trees and we're turning them into stuff. However, we're managing forests in a way which is fundamentally different from the way that they've been managed in the past, and which is based on the way that they manage themselves, the way that forests as ecosystems actually work. So we're managing them like they manage themselves. We're managing them as complex systems, so not just valuing the trees, and it does, however we get the trees that we want, that's okay. We're saying, how do we do that within a context that's ecologically reasonable and actually works in the long term, and not just for the trees, but for everything. We're recognizing the importance of all these organisms, from those invertebrates, which are so diverse, up to the trees and the large macroinvertebrates like bear that make the forest work. So we have a sort of casting a wide net and treating forests like these systems that are deserving of being complex. One of the things we're also doing is we're taking relatively young forests and we're actively converting them to be more like old growth forests. And in that process, we're making them more resilient, able to, in the long term, sequester and store more carbon and provide many of those wildlife habitat benefits of that structural diversity and complexity that are not offered by young forests. We're doing that actively before it would happen naturally. So what that means in practice is that we're cutting trees to promote many different sizes, species, and ages of trees. And rather than trying to create something like what you see in the background here is what used to be a monoculture plantation of Norway spruce. It's not even a native species. We're leaving purposefully tons of dead wood on the ground and dead standing trees. We're retaining and we're recruiting, making more of big old legacy trees. So these are trees that we're not managing as a product. We're managing them just to be big trees and eventually to be big dead trees, and to give to those forested ecosystems the benefits of those big trees. And we're creating small pockets of other habitat conditions like early successional young forest, which are underrepresented across the landscape. And so what's so radical about that is it's not just that it's addressing conditions that we've created, right? So we're trying to, in good faith, we're trying to do better, and we're trying to actually repair some of the work we've done to forests by actively trying to make them like old growth forests, trying to make them more resilient to climate change and adaptive to climate change, which is coming down the pike, to create better wildlife habitat where we've consistently degraded wildlife habitat by our land management practices. But the concept of creating local renewable resources, harvesting local renewable resources, is in itself radical, not just for its environmental implications, but also for its human rights implications. It's for justice implications. So one of the sources of environmental injustice is this not in my backyard mentality, right? So we who have the privilege to say not in my backyard can just be like, no, I don't want logging here, you know, and so I'm going to continue to consume resources, but I'm going to do so, you know, at the expense of someone else, somewhere else in the country, somewhere else in the world. Probably these resources are produced with much greater cost in terms of human costs, social costs, environmental costs. Maybe you're sacrificing this renewable resource for a non-renewable resource somewhere else. That is hugely problematic. And what is radical is saying yes in my backyard and sort of bringing your resource impacts back home, where number one, you're the one who's experiencing the impact of your own resource consumption. And then number two, you can keep an eye on how these resources are produced, and you can have more control over their impacts. Renewable resources instead of non-renewable resources, less toxic resources, is always good, and wood is great. And if we're harvesting wood within this ecological forestry framework where we can be really proud about the way that we're doing it, wood is amazing. And so wood sort of carries with it this stigma of what we think logging is and what logging is in some places, but it doesn't have to be that way. There's also these other interesting feedbacks of harvesting timber, like it makes it more affordable to own land. So when you're periodically able to make a little money off your land as a private landowner, maybe you're not as incentivized to develop or sell your land. It also lowers development pressure. So just protects our forest land in general by, you know, just contributing to this economic system, which allows people to pay their taxes. And so, you know, they can afford to own land. And also it just, I think the economic equity argument is really important. We don't want to make it so that only rich people can own land. We want to make it so that everybody can afford to own land. And this is one of the ways that we can promote that. So one of the key messages, and I think I'm right on time here, which is surprising. One of the key messages here is that we need to save our forests. Our forests are in trouble and need our help, and there are ways that we can help them. And we need to do that within also considering implications for our broader human community, for equity, for justice. We don't need to do one or the other, we need to do both. And part of what that's going to look like is forming a more complex idea of what our ecosystems are and our relationship to them and our role in them. So another Aldo Leopold quote to close here: "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and the beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise." And I think that thinking really critically about the way that we manage our forests, not just the way that, you know, in the woods we're creating forests which are more diverse and complex, but also the implications of our action or inaction on our communities, and the way that that makes our community globally and locally more or less beautiful is really, really important. Whew. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I would love to answer any questions that you have if you want to pop them in the chat there. And you can also just raise your hand or just unmute yourself, and you can ask me the question as well. Mary, you want to ask a question, or you just unmuted yourself?
I do.
Cool.
And I can unmute, yeah. I'm over at Champlain Valley Co-housing.
Yeah.
And, but more to the point, that's more to identify myself. I was very surprised when you said that most of the carbon is stored in the soils.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, that's probably, to explain that would maybe take a few minutes, but maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me actually, there was a slide that I thought was in my presentation, but that wasn't. Let me see if I can find it, and I'll show it to you guys. It's not in that one. Hold on just 1 second.
Sure.
I can't find it, but basically as I'm talking to you, I'm also going to look for it some more. But that's something that's really surprising. So we knew that from Western forests, but recently there's a project called the Forest Inventory and Analysis Project, FIA. These are fixed plots that are tested all the time that tell us a lot about our forests. So just a way of keeping an eye on our forests as they change over time. And a new version of this just came out for 2017. And what it basically said, oh, did I find it? Yeah, okay. I'm gonna share my screen again. That was some multitasking. I just stalled you. So what you see right here, so this is a graph of where carbon stocks are stored in the forest. So here it's soil organic carbon, 58% of all the carbon.
Wow.
The forest floor and litter, an additional 6%, down dead wood, 2%, standing dead trees, another 1%. So what that means is only like 30% of all the carbon in our forests is actually in living trees. So one of the things that's so profound about that is that if we're just trying to grow big trees, you can store a lot of carbon that way. But if you're trying to grow these like functional complex forests, you're actually, in the long term, you're actually going to be storing more carbon. And so the way that the carbon cycle is pretty complicated, but the way that it basically works is that carbon is fixed into the system, again, through photosynthesis, so sequestering that aerial carbon, mostly from carbon dioxide. And then it's stored for a long period of time. When it is eventually, as trees die, a lot of that carbon also is re-released. And when there's a large scale disturbance, like a big blowdown, a big patch cut, a lot of that carbon that's been fixed in the soils is, because of the increased heat, increased light, is just like broken down and digested super fast. And then it's volatilized and it goes back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So making our forest more resilient and, in most cases, resisting that large scale disturbances is a way that we're going to store more carbon in the system. And then there's also sort of, more nuanced steps you can take as you're managing your own forest. So, most of the ways that we do that are by managing forests like old growth forests, which, managing complex forests is good for everything. It is seemingly good for pretty much everything, including managing for carbon. And so you can like be in there managing a forest actively, but you could be retaining big trees. Not all of them, but you can be retaining a lot of big trees, biological legacy trees, I say. And when I talk to a logger about them, it blows their mind that I'm like, here's a big, beautiful tree and I don't want to cut it. And I say, I'm not managing that tree for timber. I'm managing that tree to be a big tree, leaving as much dead wood on the ground and in the system as you possibly can. And just managing for that structural diversity, structural complexity is really, really important. But yeah, that is, there's a bunch of amazing, as we learn more about the way that forests actually work, it increasingly takes the focus away from trees and onto other stuff. Like, for instance, there is more living biomass in a dead tree than in a living tree. So in a living tree, there's a lot of biomass, but all, dead trees are like these keystone structures of ecosystems, and everything uses them. And the living tissue in a dead tree is like invertebrates and salamanders, which are like the apex predators of the forest floor and are actually an old growth indicator species in many cases, and are also, here's another weird fact, by biomass, salamanders account for the largest amount of vertebrate predator biomass in the forest. So if you took all the salamanders and you weighed them next to all the coyotes, the salamanders weigh more. And they are these dead wood indicators, dead wood obligate species.
And that's still true, huh?
Yes. It's more true in older forests than it is in younger forests.
I love salamanders. I used to go look for them as a child in dead wood.
Yeah, that's where they live.
Redback salamanders in particular.
Who do we got?
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Nice to see you. Jeff asked, are these my ideas? Or is everyone in FPR promote ecological forestry too? So I often say that I think that everybody's in favor of forestry. They just don't know it yet. There's so many things that can be done positively in this world through the lens of forest management that I think is just so good, and that anybody could agree is really great. And so I think that there are a lot of foresters, and especially who work for the state, but also a lot of private consulting foresters who are doing this work day in and day out. They're not necessarily communicating about it in the same way, which I think is why you might hear more about me doing it than about they do it, because I'm really excited to communicate about it and talk about it. Whereas most foresters are content to just do it. But I think that there are a lot of people that are practicing these, whether they call it ecological forestry or not, there's different names for it. There are other foresters who are doing this type of work as well. Mark asked if I could speak about deer overpopulation. Is deer hunting kind of like herbicide, a necessary thing that many environmentalists are comfortable with? I think that that's definitely true. I think that, I sort of say, like, I'm always telling people to do stuff they don't want to do. I'm telling them to like cut trees. I'm telling them to kill deer. I'm telling them to use herbicide. And all of those three things are to correct very specific human created problems. So in the case of deer, we've created a more fragmented landscape. We've killed their predators, and we've created conditions where they can thrive, and decrease in hunters. So for a long time, hunters were, and we remain, the apex predator of deer on the landscape. And when we post land and create areas that are, harder and harder to hunt and control that deer population, we're effectively limiting the ability of that apex predator. Not to say that we should be the apex predator, but we are limited our ability to lower that population and keep it within a sustainable level. Our population in Vermont with deer, it's variable. In some places, it's not overpopulated. In some places, it's overpopulated by like 25%. But there are deer populations in the region in New England where they are literally 10 to 15 times the size of our total deer population over a given area. We might have 25 deer per square mile and we want 20. They have 200. That's not a joke. And when that happens, the effect of deer on our landscape is basically that they browse young trees. They eat young trees and plants. And when there's too many of them, they do that too much, and they prevent certain species from trees or plants from existing. And where they're really overpopulated, there's a process that was coined down south called forest disintegration, which is where the deer browse is so profound. The impact of that is so profound that no species are regenerating, and that this beautiful cycle that I was talking about of growth and regeneration, the death part of that's still occurring, but the regeneration is not occurring because the deer are eating all those little plants. That's a problem that we created. And so I think that we should have some role in solving that problem. Same thing with invasive plants. We introduced these species which are almost impossible to kill without using herbicide. And so even if it makes us uncomfortable, and of course we should do it like really carefully and minimally and in a super targeted way, and I could talk about that all night long, but we might have a role in fixing that problem. Same thing with cutting trees. We created a landscape which is less diverse, which doesn't have a good representation of all these different habitat types, which are so important to our wildlife. And so maybe we have a role in making that landscape more diverse. And so it's really hard though, because, you know, it's sort of this like the lever mentality. We're so scared of doing something wrong that we don't do anything, or we think that no, there's no way, humans are completely outside of the system. There's no way we could do anything that's right. And I just don't think that's true. No matter how much of a bad track record we have, I fundamentally reject the idea that there is nothing we can do that can be positive on our landscape. And especially if those things feel really uncomfortable and we know they're important and we do them anyway, maybe that's a really good litmus test for that it really needs to happen. Let's see. Jeff asked, what's the parcel size cutoff for UVA? I think you know this, Jeff, but it's 25 acres is the minimum size to be enrolled in the program, not including 2 acres around a house site. At least 20 of those 25 acres, 80% of the enrollment have to be forested. The other 5 acres can be open, so like a meadow or something like that. Deb asks, most Chittenden County towns have town forests. Burlington has a number of parks, but do they also have a town forest? They don't have a town forest that they call a town forest, but they have, you know, their parks are essentially town forests. So a town forest used to be an official designation that the Commissioner of Forest Parks and Recreation for the state would like say this forest is suitable to be a town forest, and then you would get all these resources. You get money for reforestation and acquisition. That doesn't exist anymore, and so a town forest is just any forest that a town owns. And there are actually a lot of town forests out there that towns don't even know they own. They're just these parcels that have passed to them because someone didn't pay the taxes or whatever, or that no one claimed. And is it a town forest? If you call it one, it is. It's a town forest. It's any parcel of forested land that a town owns. And so in Burlington, those parks, Ethan Allen Park, you know, Arms Park, those are effectively town forests as well. Jeff asks, how big is a large disturbance? So in the case of avoiding these large scale disturbances, you know, you get some of those characteristics of large disturbances over an acre, couple of acres. Anything bigger than that, and you're really starting to lose some carbon. And again, I make openings bigger than that sometimes to create young forest habitat, because that's also something we need. But in general, in our forests, lots of our forests, we want to prevent those larger scale disturbance, or just, you know, we don't want to make our forests, you know, force our forests to never undergo disturbance. We want to make them resilient, and we want that to be a function of their health. Joss asked me, he asked me privately, but I don't think he meant it to be. Can you talk about the appropriateness of whole tree harvesting and chipping? So whole tree harvesting, also called mechanized harvesting, chipping, chip crews. These are the crews that have the big fern gully cutter machine, a feller buncher, and they cut up the big trees and they put them on the ground, and then the whole tree is dragged out of the woods. So hand crews, or what we call hand crews, which are crews operating with like a chain, cutting down trees with a chainsaw, smaller equipment like a cable skidder, which is just like a big tractor with a cable winch on the back. They leave a lot of wood in the woods, so they cut the tops of the trees off and the branches, and they stay in the woods, which is great. These mechanized crews, no one's touching those trees until they, you know, maybe never in the whole process. It's all mechanized. And so they're bringing the whole tree out, and the tops and the branches are getting chipped, and they're getting sent to become biomass energy. Burlington Electric. There's another power plant called Rygate. Some of them are getting chipped and turned into heating wood, what they call school wood, chips that heat our schools. So that is definitely, it's a more intensive, you know, it's bigger equipment, less dead wood left in the woods. It's more intensive. I still think that there is a place for it in the way that we manage our forests. I used a whole tree crew on my own land. And the reason for it was because my forest was extensively high graded. So they basically cut all the healthy trees. They left all the unhealthy trees. And the only way that it was going to be healthy again, you know, within the next couple hundred years, is if I basically started over in some of these areas. So went back through the areas that they'd cut all the healthy trees in and cut all the unhealthy trees that they left behind. It was such a non-profitable, low value job, the job on my property, that there's no way I could have gotten someone with a chainsaw to do it. I think I could only get a whole tree crew to do it. And, there's other situations like that where I think that a whole tree crew can be used and it can be really good. The other thing that's really interesting is that we want to recruit more like smart, thoughtful, young loggers. And it's hard for me to look them in the eye and tell them that they should be a logger and that they should work on a hand crew, because it's like insanely dangerous. And mechanized crews are much safer, which is another part of it. Like if we're moving towards some future idealistic view of what forest management is going to look like, we also want loggers who you can go to work and be a logger and it's like a good job and you have like retirement savings and you can provide for your family and you have health insurance. And it's not something where like you're trudging around risking your life every day, ideally. Loggers that do it because they love it. It's that I think there's definitely something to be said for that as well. Brent asks, do you have a resource for forest owners on how young forests should be managed to increase complexity and more quickly become an old growth acting forests? And can you explain how earthworms are a threat to forests? So there is a really good, let me get you a link to it. There is a really good resource that was created by Tony D'Amato. That's about managing forests for old growth attributes. So the type of forestry that I practice could be called ecological forestry, which is just broadly, managing forests like they manage themselves. It's also called disturbance-based forestry or new forestry. And then within that, there's sort of this idea of managing for old growth forest, or what we call late successional attributes. And Tony really took the lead on, or really has taken the lead on helping us understand what those are and how to manage for them. Let me just find this. Here we go. I'm going to put a link in the chat. Oh, that's not what I want. I can't find it right now, but I know it's on there. I'm just having a hard time multitasking. But if you search for restoring old growth attributes, Tony D'Amato, apostrophe AMATO, you'll find it. It's another publication that he did with Paul Catanzaro. That's relatively recent in the last couple of years. So that's one of my favorite resources out there. It talks about what old growth forests are like and the sort of features that we can actively encourage to make them become like old growth forests sooner. So forests are going, in lieu of all of these other threats, climate change, global change, invasive exotic plants, deer overbrowsing, and pollution, all these other things, forest fragmentation and loss. In lieu of all those other things, forests are theoretically going to become old growth forests on their own. But that is going to take hundreds of years. And the habitat features that are offered by old growth forests are valuable, and our wildlife need them. And there's, with talking about climate change resiliency and all these other things, there's also increasingly reasons why we want to have those attributes. And so instead of waiting for all this time, we can actively encourage those attributes. And at the same time, we can create a local renewable resource, which also has all these feedbacks into preventing and mitigating climate change, in addition to all these other justice and equity related stuff. And so I think for me, it's a no-brainer. And I feel just like so proud to cut trees in that way for that reason. But it's definitely a complicated concept. Okay, I think at 8:30 the Zoom will end, but I'm going to answer one more question from Jeff. Does forest fragmentation fit into any Act 250 criteria? Should it? That long driveway you showed must have gone through Act 250 permitting. I don't know, you might know better than I do, Jeff. we can talk offline about if it did or not. But Act 250, so Act 250 is the state plan. It's supposed to be a statewide series of standards that protect our public interests, right? That help us develop in a way that's responsible, not just to the people who own the property, but to all of us and to our collective interest. And whether it does that or not, I think is a point of contention. And there's a certainly room for improvement. And for that reason, there's some review of our Act 250 system that's happened over the last couple of years in the legislature. This year, there was a whole huge package, and it boiled down to two different things, which I don't know if it's going to make it through the process or not. Some people are not supporting it, as is my bosses, the administration, because it doesn't go nearly far enough to address the many issues with Act 250. But they are two pretty cool. It's basically boiled down to people in parcels in Act 250 review have to consider forest fragmentation, and to prevent something that was making it so that people who had recreational trail systems, that was considered for Act 250 review. And out in the Northeast Kingdom with some of the victory trails and some of those areas, that was creating some really weird situations. But so it's not far enough, I think, is the idea that people that oppose it have, or some people just oppose it in general. But those two parts of it are pretty cool. And forest fragmentation, if that passes this session, that could be part of it. And oh, Jeff, you said the governor just vetoed it. So we'll see if it makes it through. So with that, I'm going to say thank you all so much for coming and hanging with me for this time. Please know that if you have questions about this, you can always just give me a call or shoot me an email. I'm happy to help if I can. If you're in a different county, you have a county forester, and one of our jobs is to be resources for people who want to keep forests healthy and manage their forests better. And if you want to see this recording again, you can go on my YouTube channel, just search for Chittenden County Forester on YouTube, and you'll find a recording of it there probably tomorrow. So thank you all so much.
Thank you also, Ethan. Very nice.
Have a good night, everybody.